Hey, we're at the end of our series we've been doing. We're calling it Life Interrupted, where we're just talking about like suffering and pain and some of the challenges that we experience just by virtue of being alive. That life can be interrupted, and just maybe by way of recap, even to put us on the same page. The first week of the series, we just did like a baseline view of suffering with two very simple ideas about suffering that are true. One is that you need to be ready for it, that the Bible nowhere promises that we are exempt, so we have to be ready for suffering. And then we also talked about the first week that not only do we have to be ready for suffering, but we also have to be prepared to not understand why always. And that sometimes suffering comes and we're not going to understand it, and realizing that God never says that we will. And so that's important as we consider suffering. And then we looked the last 2 weeks and we just talked about the suffering that comes our way that we kind of can't understand and that we can't explain. And it's the suffering that we experience. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the suffering that we could experience by our own actions, by our own sin. Truth is, as hard as it is to say, that a lot of times the problems that we experience are the result of us sinning, like of us doing things that God wouldn't want us to do. And so deal with some of that. You might be able to help some of the suffering. And then last week, what we did is we talked about the suffering that we experience, not because of something we did, but we talked about the suffering that we experience because of the actions of other people. And man, like, if that was the only two causes of suffering, mentally there'd be something, it'd be a little bit more easier to process, right? That if you could explain every problem that came into your life by either saying, I created that one, or we live in a fallen world and people have free will and they created that by virtue of that would be a lot easier to explain. But the truth is that those aren't the only two kinds of suffering that we experience. Sometimes what happens in life is that we experience suffering and pain, and we don't really know why. And that's really where we're going to go this last week, and we're going to look at the book of Job. We're going to cover the whole book of Job. So hopefully you're ready for me to read a lot. No, just kidding. That'd be suffering too if I read the whole book of Job to you. But no, we're gonna look at the book of Job because Job's suffering is a suffering that really is hard to explain. And hopefully, as we look at his story, we'll be able to maybe apply some of that to our lives as we go forward. So just maybe by a little bit of introduction, Job. Job's a great dude. Like, he's a guy that the Bible speaks super highly of. That a lot of people believe that he was a contemporary of Abraham, so he would have lived about that same time during the book of Genesis. And this is what the Bible says about Job. Job chapter 1, verses 1 and 3. It says, there was a man who lived in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Verse 3, this man was the greatest of all of the people of the East. So you have Job. When it says he's like blameless, it doesn't mean he's never sinned. There's only one person that's never sinned, and that's Jesus. But what it's saying about Job is it's saying that Job was a man who cared about God. He cared about the things that God cared about. That it was important to Job that his life lived in a way that brought glory and honor to God, and that he was very aware of God in his dealings. So much so that even a little bit later in this chapter, you see Job, that he was such a righteous man that he did like a just-in-case sacrifice for his kids regularly, just in case they sinned and they didn't realize it. That he cares deeply about pleasing the Lord. Not only does he care deeply about pleasing the Lord, but it says there in verse 3 that he was the greatest man of all of the peoples of the East, which is quite the statement to say of someone who may have been a contemporary of Abraham. And so you've got this thing with Job where he is a righteous man, cares about the Lord, cares about following God. And not only that, but man, he's doing well for himself. He's a man of stature. That people would have known him because of his stature and the things that he's accomplished. He's one of those guys. Easy peasy, right? Like, all good. But then as the text goes forward, you see that's when things get tricky. Chapter 1, verse 6, it says this, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, 'From where have you come?' And Satan answered the Lord, 'From going to and fro on the earth, from walking up and down on it.' And the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? For there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil.' Then Satan answered the Lord and said, 'Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face.'" Now, there is so much mystery around the book of Job, okay? And it's really important to maybe not dive into the stuff that we don't know the answer to. And maybe someday we'll cover the book of Job and we'll talk about the heavenly council, but just this is what we know what's going on. Is we know that Satan is going to and fro all over the earth, which lines up with 1 Peter, where it says that Satan is a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. So he's going all throughout the earth looking for someone to devour, and for whatever reason, somehow he ends up in the court of God. And God's like, "What are you doing, Satan?" And Satan's like, "Well, I'm just kind of going around the earth looking for someone to take down." And God's like, "You thought about Job?" Which is such a weird thing if you think about it, right? Have you thought about Job? And Satan's response is basically that, man, my stuff won't work on Job because you have blessed him so much. And so Satan's like, if you let me take away his stuff, then he will curse you to your face. So basically what God ends up saying to Satan as the interaction goes, he's like, "Fine. You can do whatever you want to Job, just don't touch his body." So in the course of one day, Job loses all of his possessions and he loses all of his family. Horrifying day for a person. And you think, okay, this is the thing. This is what's going to get him. But one of the things we see from this book is that God is always right. That Job loves God for more than what he has. And the reason why we know that is because at the end of chapter 1, what Job does is he sings a worship song to God after he loses everything. And the last line of the song is this. It's in Job 121. This is Job singing. And he says, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Then some time passes. So Job has lost everything. Some time passes. We don't know how much time it was. And what ends up happening is Satan is going to and fro over the earth looking for people to take down. And he ends up in front of God again, in front of this heavenly council. And God's like, "Satan, what are you doing?" Satan's like, "I'm just going around the earth looking for someone to take down." And God says, "Have you tried Job?" Which is like, as if he hasn't gone through enough, right? And Satan says to God, he's like, it doesn't matter. Job's going to be fine. He's like, because he has his health. But if you let me touch his body, then that'll do it. And this is kind of that interaction a little bit that you see in chapter 2, where God says this, talking about Job. He says that he still holds fast to his integrity. "Although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." And then Satan answered God, or the Lord, and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has, he'll give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he's in your hand. Only spare his life." I think it's interesting. Satan's like, well, he has his health. So he's fine. I think of all the people that I know that have their health and they still curse God. You know what I mean? But he's like, no, if you let me take his health, then surely he will curse you to his face. So God ends up saying, fine, just don't kill him. You can touch his body, but you cannot kill him. And so Satan ends up inflicting these sores on Job that are so bad that he like the only way he finds any relief is he breaks clay pots and scratches the sores, and that gives him some level of relief. And so Job, now he has lost all of his possessions, he's lost his family except for his wife, and now his health is so miserable that the only way he can find comfort is by scratching himself with clay pots. And then you kind of shift to a different part of the book where so the beginning of the book, that Satan is attacking Job. Satan's coming after Job. And then after Satan is done coming after Job, what's interesting is people start attacking Job after that. And the first person to really come after Job is his wife. And in chapter 2, after Job has lost like all of his stuff and his possessions, he's scratching himself with these pots, his wife shows up and she's like, Job, just curse God and die. And then Job responds to her and says probably, I would say, one of the more challenging verses for us to consider. And he says this to his wife. He says, shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? Makes me think about this old song that we used to sing, and it's old for me. And it was like, he gives and takes away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. But Job's like, how can I be okay to take all of the good that God has given me and not take the bad? So as this book, the rest of Job kind of goes through, just to kind of give you a big picture of what happens, and then we're going to apply it, is the next, really, we're in chapter 2, the next, 30 plus chapters are Job's friends telling him everything he got wrong, basically. And Job will kind of respond to his friends, he'll pray in the midst of it all, and you just kind of see this dialogue. And then after a certain amount of time, what happens is God just shows up. He talks to Job. And he shows up, he talks to Job, he ends up, kind of coming on hard on Job's friends, and then he ends up restoring Job, all of his possessions, sevenfold, and Job ends up, at the end of the book, very, very blessed. And so thinking of the story of Job as it pertains to the suffering that we experience that we don't understand, okay, I want to look at the framework we've looked at the last few weeks to try to explain this. And so I want to look at how we get it wrong, how it changes us, how it helps other people, and then ultimately how this suffering that comes our way that we don't understand, how it glorifies God. And the first thing is, okay, so how do we get it wrong? How do we get the suffering wrong that comes our way that we don't understand? And that's one of the things where I think Job is incredibly helpful. I read a commentary a few years back on the book of Job, and it was the Preaching the Word Biblical Commentary, and it goes through all of the things the friends say. And what's interesting is a lot of the things that the friends say to Job is ways that we try to explain away our suffering when maybe there isn't an answer. And you see one example of that very clearly in chapter 5, verse 6. Okay, this is one of Job's friends showing up to Job, and this is what they say to Job. For affliction does not come from the dust, nor does trouble sprout up from the ground. Okay, and this shows us one of the ways that we get this type of suffering wrong. And it's that we think that the only reason why we're suffering is because we did something. Okay, we think that that we must have done something to create this, because that's what Job's friend is saying. What he's saying is trouble doesn't just happen naturally. That the only reason why trouble comes is it comes because you did something to create it. which, okay, like, sounds a lot like week 2 of this series, doesn't it? Like, there's some challenge because there certainly are moments where we are the cause of the suffering that we experience. And there's even an element of saying it this way in front of a group of people that I'm afraid that we will stop taking responsibility for the things that we do. But be that as it may, something the book of Job shows us is that just because we are suffering does not mean that we did something to earn it. And that's really helpful, and that's really practical and important for, I would say, 2 reasons. One, there are some of you here, okay, and you're experiencing suffering. And you've looked at it objectively, and you cannot figure out why. You've talked to your friends about it, and friends who love you, who won't just tell you what you want to hear, and you've talked to them, and they can't come up with a reason why, and so you've come to this conclusion that the only reason why I am experiencing this thing, it has to be penance for something that I've done in the past. And the book of Job shows us that that's not necessarily true. That's not how it works. Another reason why this is incredibly important, because we think that we do something, is the other side of that coin. And the other side of that coin is that there are some people, what they try to do is they try to manipulate God with their goodness. There's this thought where it's like, okay, if I just do the right thing, if I go to church, if I give, if I raise my family a certain way, if I do all of these things, then certainly no evil will come upon me because I have done so many things that are good. God wouldn't do that. And the book of Job shows us that you can't manipulate God with your goodness. That even looking at the book of Job, like what happens to Job, it isn't because he's evil, it's actually because of his goodness that it happens. So we have to be aware that that's part of it. Another way that we get it wrong is that we think that God has no power over it. Maybe we come to this place where it's this suffering that we're experiencing that we don't understand, and it's like, well, since I don't understand it, I can't understand where it's coming from, certainly God has no power over this thing at all, because if he did, this wouldn't be happening. And this is where one of the things we can look at one of the things that we do know from the book of Job. And it's that Satan, he wasn't able to run roughshod over Job. That Satan, he was only able to do what God allowed and no further. Like there was no moment where he's like, I said I can't touch his body, I'm going to tickle. Like there was none of that going on. That God said, hey, you cannot do this, and Satan never dared do something that God said. So what is, even though we don't understand what's happening, it doesn't mean that God doesn't have power over it, because he did have power over what was going on with Job. He just didn't understand it. Another thing we do with suffering, the way we get it wrong, like really hard suffering, is we think that no good could come of it. We think that, man, with this thing that I am going through, there is no way that there's anything good that could come of this. And there's this book, I read it a while back. It's a really good book, but it's going to sound very strange. It's the book, The Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, okay? It's this conversation with like a head demon and a lower demon, and I get it. It sounds strange if you haven't read it, but it is good. Unless you don't like it, then it's not, but it's good. And it's this conversation, the head demon, lower demon, and they're talking about a person. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get this person to walk away from God. And at some point in this person's life where they're trying to get to walk away from God, he experiences suffering. And the lower demon is like, that's a good thing. This is going to get him away. But the head demon's like, no, No, suffering can actually be really bad for us demons. Because what suffering can do is it can cause people to follow God based on far more than their emotions. That what suffering can do is it can cause a person to follow God just for God himself. And we think about suffering, okay? And oftentimes when we think about it like apologetically or trying to talk against the faith is we often think of like one side of the coin. And it's the side of the coin where it's like, I knew this person, they loved Jesus, they followed Jesus, something bad happened to them and they walked away. And we're like, man, that's real and that happens. But the problem with that is just being like a way to say that suffering is evil and the good never comes of it, is that for every person who has walked away from God because of suffering, there's another person who's found strength in God from suffering. And not only is there just as many people who are finding strength in God through their suffering, that I would argue that there are people who experience suffering, who follow Jesus, and the suffering that they experienced was actually the thing that brought their relationship with God to a different level. And so we see this, we tell ourselves no good will come of it, but that's just not true. Okay, so that's how we get it wrong. Then how does it change us? How can this kind of suffering that we don't understand, how can it change us? And it really, you do get to decide how it changes you. Like you get to decide how you want to let it change you. And what I love about the book of Job is you see how it ultimately changed him. That in the last verse of the book of Job, so you can tell people you read the whole book of Job today. I don't know who's asking, but if they are, and then you'll be lying because you didn't, so don't. But the last verse, but you did read the first verse and the last verse, so that's kind of whatever, I don't know. But this is the last verse, and it says, and Job died an old man full of days. Okay, two things on this. Job was restored. God blessed him again financially. God blessed him with another family. God gave him all this stuff back. And even though God restored him, he still died. Which I know, it's like, duh, like Job's not running around the world still, like, but okay, but that's important. Because it shows us with suffering that eventually there comes a point where you're not going to escape it. But eventually there comes a point where, no, you die. And even Job, even after he was restored, he still experienced the suffering that comes from the world that we live in. Now, less interesting than the fact like that Job died was how it says his life was. And it says that he died an old man full of days. And that phrase full of days is an interesting expression in the Old Testament because it doesn't say that about everyone who dies. It said it about Abraham, it said it about David, it said it about Jacob. And it's this idea with Job. Like Job died as a person whose life was full. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't looking back thinking, man, that season, I'm never going to forget about. No, he died as an old man full of days, able to trust God with all that came his way. Which shows, okay, so we get to decide, so what did it do? What should it do? How can it change us? Well, one of the ways it can change us is it can humble us. That this type of suffering, it can humble us. And the reason why it can humble us is, just thinking of Job. Like there's nothing he really did. Like if he would have caused it, well then he could have stopped it. And when we experience this type of suffering, we didn't do anything to cause it. Well, it's humbling because if we didn't do anything to cause it, then we can't do anything to stop it. We're just completely at the mercy of someone else. That's humbling. Not only is that, but when this whole thing ends with Job, when the suffering finally stops, it doesn't stop because Job prayed some prayer. It doesn't happen. It doesn't stop because Job finally offered the right sacrifice. it just ended because it was over, because God said it was over, which shows us it's humbling because we realize that we are completely at the mercy of someone else. And that is a picture of our salvation. That you're only saved, not because of anything that you've done. You're saved because of what God has done for you in Jesus Christ. That we are totally there. And there's something about our salvation that it should humble all of us. Because there's nothing we can do to earn it. That we're walking by faith and we're fully trusting the actions of another to be enough to save us. There's something incredibly humbling about that. Another way that this type of suffering, I would say, changes us is it deepens our relationship with God. And like, you get to decide, like, but Job's at this place where he doesn't know what's going on, and what is consistent with Job throughout the book is that he keeps looking to God in the midst of what he's experiencing. If you ever read the book of Job, one of the things that is one of the first time I read it, I found this really challenging, and really it wasn't until that I read a commentary and some study help that I kind of understood this a little bit better. But one of the challenges with the book of Job is you read the friends, okay? And if you read the friends' stuff at a surface level, like, it makes sense. Like, there are preachers all over the country right now probably who are using, like, the friends' words to prove text points in their sermon because they didn't do their research, okay? Like, there are things that they say that sound really right. And so the question that comes at the end is like, why was God so hard on him? It seemed like what they said was right. And God was hard on them and not on Job in the same way. It's because the friends kept talking to Job. They kept trying to explain things that they didn't understand. And Job kept seeking God. Was Job frustrated? Absolutely. Was he confused? Who wouldn't be? But in the midst of all of it, he kept seeking God. And because he kept seeking God, that when this whole thing is over, he's able to have a life that's full of years and a depth to his relationship with God that only came because of what he experienced. So we do the same, even just thinking about the book of Job. Like, as we watch him, I mean, it shows us how we approach suffering too, which would be another thought here is, okay, so how does it help others? How does this kind of suffering that we experience, we don't understand, how can this type of suffering help other people? And it's worth saying that in every message in this series, we have brought this up at one way or another. Even the first message was kind of the closing of week one, and kind of like a meta point, okay, is that even when we suffer, we still have to help other people. I know that for me, I am so selfish. That when I suffer, when I go through something, that I just want to turn inward and not think of anyone other than myself. And I'm a fatalist too. Like, I'll get sick and I'll be like, I'm never gonna get better. Like, that's kind of where there's this tendency when we suffer to only think about ourselves. But what we have to understand is that just because we're suffering doesn't mean that we get to take our eyes off of other people too. Now, I'm not saying there's a time to mourn. And for every person, that's different, okay? Like, there's a time to mourn. But that time isn't forever. And I think that's what really matters. And even thinking of Job, when you think of everything that Job went through, he still has to, like, God still instructs him to do something for his friends. So God ends up showing up at the end, and he tells the friends, he's like, hey, offer a sacrifice for your nonsense that you said. And then after they offer a sacrifice, it says this, and this is while Job is still suffering, okay? He's scratching himself with those bowls at this point. And this is what God says to Job to do in the midst of his suffering. He says, and my servant Job shall pray for you. And I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. He's like, Job will pray for you. I want Job to pray for you, okay? Which you're like, seriously, you want me to pray for them? Like, why don't you give me my stuff? You know what I mean? Like, that's what God wants him to do. And then this happens 2 verses later. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. So it's not a formula, okay? Like if Job would have prayed for his friends in chapter 6, he wouldn't have got his stuff back. But he ends up getting it back after he prays for his friends. And what we have to realize is that we're not off the hook just because we're going through something. That there still is this expectation that we care. And then as we do this, okay, so how does it help other people? Well, what it does for other people is it models what Jesus is like. That if we can love people when we're going through it, I mean, is that not what Jesus did? When we can pray for our frenemies, I mean, is that not what Jesus did? When we're able to think about other people and God's kingdom in the spite of all of these things that we're going through, I mean, is that not what Jesus did? Even just thinking about that model, you got Job. And for thousands of years, the book of Job has been a great comfort to people who have gone through incredible hardship. And I would bet that when Job was living, when he was living it, he wasn't thinking, this is going to make a great book of the Bible. But it became this source, and the same is true with your life. Your life's not going to become a book of the Bible, but as you live your life, people see how you live your life. And they're going to pay even more attention to how you live your life based on how you handle things that are difficult. And you're able to communicate to them in the same way that Job's life communicates to us. And then you see this, how does it glorify God? How does the suffering that we don't understand, how does it glorify God? And I go back to my first really 2 thoughts of the series, which is that we have to be ready for suffering. And then we have to be ready not to know why. And not to always understand why we are suffering. And okay, Job is so interesting. So Job and his friends have this conversation, and God shows himself to Job. He reveals himself to Job in this whirlwind. Job has been crying out, doing all of this stuff. You would think that when God shows up to Job, he's going to explain to him the whole story. You would think that when God shows up to Job, he's like, hey, man, I get it. Let me explain this to you. There was a council in heaven. Satan said this thing. He said that there was no one. And I just want you to know that I believed in you and in God. And he's like, I used you to prove Satan wrong. That's what you would expect. But when God shows up to Job, he doesn't say any of that. That when God shows up to Job, you know what he tells him? He tells him about his power. He tells him about his wisdom. He talks about what he's capable of and who he is. And he never tells him why. I came across this quote from the scholar Francis Anderson. He wrote a commentary on the book of Job, and he says this. He says, it is one of the many excellencies of the book of Job that he's brought to contentment without ever knowing all the facts of the case. To withhold the full story from Job, even after the test was over, keeps him walking by faith and not by sight. He does not say in the end, I see it all. He never sees it all. All he sees is God. So what do we see from this? How do we glorify God in the midst of this suffering that we don't understand? Is that we have to focus on the who, not the why. that you might not get your answer. And the thing is, your answer is not what you need. What you need is you need him. And if you have him, it doesn't really matter what you go through, that he'll be right there with you. And he'll be enough to get you through. A couple years ago, we were traveling, and we had a connecting flight. And this was the first time I've never missed a connecting flight. I didn't even know. I just figured that it always worked perfectly. And I'm sitting there at the tarmac of the first airport that we're getting ready to go to for our connecting flight. And I knew it was going to be bad because I finished an entire movie in the tarmac before the plane took off. The plane eventually does end up taking off after my movie is over. And then we get to the airport. And they're just doing that really fun thing that airplanes do where they just circle the airport, but they don't go down. You know what I mean? They finally land. And they don't take us to the gate. It's a big airport. They end up taking us to some parking lot, and we have to get on a bus. I mean, we missed our flight by so long that we didn't even think there would be, I'm glad they didn't wait for us at that point, you know what I mean? Because then everyone on that plane would have hated the Goeden family. And Joanne and I, we've never missed a flight. We have things we're going to do in 24 hours. Like, we've got to get to this place that we're getting ready to get to. Man, we're feeling it. This trip wasn't free. And so we're like, man, what do we do? You know who wasn't worried at all? Those two kids that were with us. We get off that little tarmac, off that bus. First thing they ask me is, so are there going to be vouchers for food at this place or what? And why didn't they care? Well, because they knew we had it. They knew mom and dad were going to take care of it. They're not even thinking about the fact we missed the flight. Life gets interrupted. Things are going to happen. But if you know the person who's in control, ultimately they're going to make sure that you get where you need to go. And more important than knowing why and fixating on details is making sure that you know the one who's going to take you where you ultimately need to go. Let's pray. God, we love you. We're thankful for who you are. I'm thankful, Jesus, that we can trust you in the midst of interrupted lives because of who you are, because of what you've done, because of the price that you paid for our sins. And God, I'm thankful that you have made a way for us. And I know it's unrealistic to assume that there's no one in this room who's not experiencing suffering right now. And I pray, God, by the power of your Spirit, that it would go away. I do, and it's okay. But I also pray that they would know you better. I pray that they would look to you more. I pray that they would find you to be enough in the moments where life happens in a way that we don't always understand. And that by your power and your grace, in the midst of something that could sink other people, God, that you would use it to help us know you better. God, maybe there are people in this room, and the reality of this, of their life is they don't have a relationship with you. And here's what I can say. God, you and I both know this, that my message is only true to people who follow you. That those are the people who can find hope in the midst of life's deepest and darkest storms. And I pray, God, that by the power of your Spirit, that you would awaken their hearts to their need for you. That they'd quit telling themselves all those excuses that they know are lies, but it makes them feel better and helps them leave. But you would help them, God, in this moment to see that they need you. That they would humble themselves and trust you. God, I pray by the power of your Spirit that you would do that. I'm thankful that no matter what we go through, we can look to you and we can know you. And so, God, would you be exalted as we do? Jesus, it's in your name we pray. Amen. Love you guys.
Thank you so much for watching us today. If you'd like to know more about what's going on here at New Life Church, you can go to our website, nlspringfield.com, and check out everything that's coming up. Also, if you'd like to be part of what God is doing here at New Life by giving, you can do so by going to giving.nlspringfield.com. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.